Welcome to Connect with County Leaders. Here's your host, Bryan Hill.
Hello and welcome to Connect with County Leaders. I'm Bryan Hill. On this edition of the podcast, I am excited to be joined by my friend, Clark Mercer, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, commonly known as COG. Clark, welcome to the podcast and thank you for being here.
Well, we do a lot of work together and thank you for having me out for the show. Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure. You know, people probably don't know this about Clark Mercer. We have actually met in 2018-ish, somewhere around then when you were working for the governor's office, and we had to do something that was very interesting during our time. Our first engagement, we had to talk about COVID and COVID-19. Before we start with peppering you with questions, I just want to say thank you for your leadership during that time. Without you, we wouldn't have gotten through it. The state, the Commonwealth, thank you for all the hard work you did, because I knew you were moving pieces like I was moving pieces, and we never knew what piece was coming next. So, yeah, you want to give a little intro or a little background on that
Sure.
experience?
I mean, well, thank you. I mean, it was a tough time for the country. It was a tough time for the Commonwealth. You know, I do think as a state we did well. When you look at the number of deaths per capita, we had some of the fewest in the country, top 10 in terms of saving folks' lives, but it was a lot of sacrifices.
Yeah.
And obviously I have two children in middle school. They were in elementary school at the time. Took a toll on our kids and their school and small businesses. And, you know, being in Richmond, being the governor's chief of staff, you know, this is a big state with a lot of folks, a lot of different takes on issues. So, you know, you'd make a decision and take an action. And you know, I felt like half the state would feel like you didn't go far enough, and the other half that you went too far. So I was trying to strike that balance. Governor Northam was the only physician in the country that served as governor, which was a good thing in terms of his bedside manner to the public, but also there was an expectation that he would solve COVID, and he would often remark behind the scenes, I'm not that kind of doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a neurologist, I deal with children, but he was the right person to lead the state at that time, and we certainly got through it, and the economy is doing well, and small businesses are rebounding, but lots of lessons learned for sure.
Well, no doubt there was a lot of lessons learned, and you know your czar that you hired, who's now the Richmond mayor, which is ironic. Danny Avila was also very instrumental in how we projected out what we were going to do, from mass vaccination clinics to just communication, tying in with our public health departments. You know, spot on to you and your team down there in Richmond. But now. Thank you. Now you're in God's country. You're up here in the DMV. Wait a minute. What school did you go to? What high school?
Was then T.C. Williams, now Alexander City High School, home of the Titans.
Home of the Titans. Now,
Yeah.
How's it been since you've been back in you know what we call the DMV?
Well, I love the region, and Fairfax County has great public schools. Can't all be Titans, but you know, grew up here. My mom still lives in the same house she grew up in, so we have deep roots in the region. And the Council of Governments offices are in the District of Columbia. We have great members in Maryland, and we are a region. We live, work, and play across boundaries every day. So it's great being back up, seeing old, you know, high school friends, and my kids are now in middle school, same middle school that I went to, and enjoying things and doing well. So it's been great. My sister lives here in Fairfax County. She's an early childhood educator in the public school system. And
Hayfield? We have people at Hayfield?
Two nephews at Hayfield. One nephew went to Lake Braddock. So yeah.
So, you know, COG is an association of 24 local governments in the Washington metropolitan area. You know, the question is, how have you seen us all melding together to make it a better DMV?
Sure. Well, a lot of times folks will ask me, okay, what is COG and kind of why does it exist? The federal government requires, if you have over 25,000 people in a region, to have a metropolitan planning organization, MPO. And they require that because transit and transportation projects have to be in an MPO's long-term plan. They don't want to give Fairfax County money for a transportation project that borders Alexander, Arlington, that they're not going to build. So they want a region to be coordinated. So there's hundreds of MPOs across the country. Many regions in the country realize we should be coordinating on more than just transportation and transit. Affordable housing is an issue for the whole region. Homelessness is an issue for the whole region. How we coordinate mental health is an issue that doesn't just stop at a border. Clean air, clean water doesn't stop at border on a map. Public safety. So issues that you think and hope government should be coordinating on to deliver better services to your citizens, That's where the Council of Governments comes in.
Well, you know, we are also looking at growth projections and how they influence our regional planning and our priorities. What do you see from your seat that we need to keep continuously? Obviously, you mentioned some of it, but what other things do you think we need to hit?
Sure, we're a region that's growing. It wasn't too many years ago that we were about 3 million people in this region. Now we're at 6 million. And the projections, working with all the planners in your department here and all the municipalities across the region, we're going to add 1.5 million people by 2050 and 1.1 million jobs. So when you think about that, Fairfax County alone is slated by 2050 to add 200,000 people. That's more than the city of Alexandria right now will be added to Fairfax County. Obviously, housing is an issue. I mean, I mentioned moving back to the hometown I grew up in last summer, and there wasn't many homes available. Obviously, interest rates were an issue, giving up the mortgage rate I had and getting a new one, but there's just not enough units, and they're certainly not affordable. So many of the folks I went to then T.C. Williams can't afford to live in the hometown that they grew up in. So we're gonna keep growing, and we're gonna keep adding jobs, and the adding jobs part's important. When you're trying to recruit a company, and you all do a great job out here in Fairfax County doing that, one of the first things they'll look at is, one, do we have the workforce? And we do. We've got great colleges, great high schools, we've got smart, dynamic workforce. Can they live here? And is it going to be affordable? So that's a big issue that the council's working on, in addition to the other issues that I mentioned.
Yeah, you know, we talk about affordability, and obviously we have a lot of job openings here in Fairfax, let alone Northern Virginia, let alone the DMV. But when we talk about affordability, we also talk about, well, when they get here, how do we move them around? I mean, what we're dealing with in our region with WMATA and the ongoing thought process of, all right, how do we get cars off the road? How do we become a better transit-oriented system, as well as maintaining the state of good repair? Because all of that costs money. And we were, collectively, you're spearheading a DMV Moves project. Why don't we talk a little bit about what you thought of and how to get this started and what we've been going through?
Sure. So when you think of a regional asset that Maryland, D.C., and Virginia and the federal government invested in shares, there's not a better example than our metro system. And we've got a number of other transit providers. You've got the connector out here in Fairfax County. We've got about a dozen bus systems. We've got VRE and MARC. You know, Metro provides about 87% of all the bus service here in the region, so they're obviously the big show in town, but we do have other providers as well. And when you think about those growth patterns, how do we move folks around? How do we lower our carbon footprint and meet our clean energy goals? Transit's a big piece of that equation. And transit and transportation is expensive. Infrastructure is expensive. I drove today. I drove out from Alexandria, and those are expensive roads that I'm driving on, and you see the managed lanes. Those are not inexpensive lanes to jump on.
Yeah.
And you know, inflation and some of the costs that have been increasing over the past few years, Metro's not immune to that. And it's just like in your day job in the county, if something is the responsibility.
Did you say day job?
Your day job, your full-time job, your 24/7 job.
Thank you.
There you go.
There you go.
But if something is 5 people's responsibility, sometimes it's nobody's.
Yeah.
And so Metro is a shared responsibility between Maryland, Virginia, D.C., and the federal government. There's some advantage to that. There's also some drawbacks. The way that Metro has been set up and funded over the years, you have to go essentially to 4 different board of directors every year to justify your existence and your budget.
Right.
And those board of directors change. Governors change, Congress changes. So we have pulled together DMV Moves, which is a subset of the Metro board and the COG board, so leaders from Virginia, Maryland. Governor Moore's office is represented, Governor Youngkin, Mayor Bowser's office is represented, and the federal government to put on the table what are some areas that we can drive better efficiencies and coordinate so that users in this region can make sense of our transit network. And then a funding model that does 2 things. One, gives Metro the predictability it needs to run a business, because it's hard to run a business year in and year out when you don't know what's going to be coming in, but also gives you and the folks funding Metro the predictability of what it's going to cost to fund Metro year in and year out. And Metro needs that kind of funding coming in the door so they can run a business, but they're on the accountability side, they also need to know, okay, we need to live within our means from year in and year out. And so we're looking at, you know, what a dedicated type of revenue might look like. And when you hear that, what does that mean? That means predictable money coming in the door to Metro that's unencumbered by different requirements that states may put on it, so that they can bond it. And if they can bond their money coming in, particularly in the capital side, it will allow them to stretch tax dollars much further.
But you and I have had numerous conversations about predictability, right? Predictability is fine once we in Virginia or they in Maryland understand, or DC, they know how much they're going to fund. Being able to bond is associated with what the regional components of it. The state, you cannot bond their funding.
That's right.
Well, you can bond funding, predictable funding that's coming from, say, Fairfax, Arlington, Loudoun, Alexandria City. And Maryland has different laws, and the district has different laws. For instance, I am predicting right now that Metro will have a bond and will be a part of our bond in 2026. That is going to happen, no matter what. But if I ask the state to do that, it does not happen. So we have to have a little bit, and this is something that I love about you. You always allow us a little wiggle room, and we try to articulate it in a fashion where we can all move together on the same page. But predictability, I totally agree with you. The mechanism of how we get to that predictability is still something that we're working on with DMV Move.
Yeah, and the end goal to make sure that there's some amount of money that comes in unencumbered. And you can imagine there are ideas and thoughts that Maryland has in terms of how they want something run, and DC might have in Virginia. If everyone adds different things to that funding, it makes it hard for them to then go and bond that and get big projects done and get that state of good repair. Continue to keep that state. They've done phenomenal work in the last few years working through their backlog, but we don't want to end up where we were 10 years ago with tracks being shut down and accidents and that sort of thing.
Well, that's about indexing, because we need to ensure that they are able to grow at a normal rate.
Yeah, so a lot of the money going to Metro right now is flat. And some of the new money was generated in 18. I was in the governor's office when we got that done, and it wasn't indexed to any sort of inflationary measure. I don't know, that'll be up to the elected officials, up to you working with the elected officials, what that is,
right?
What that percentage is, whether it's tied to something like, cost of living or wage growth, but something that grows reasonably, because just as your costs have increased the last few years with inflation, and you look at the highway budgets for our DOTs, they've increased. Metro's not immune to that. Right. They've got rail, a lot of rail cars, buses, and personnel, and those costs have increased. And then on the flip side of that, once we kind of agree, okay, this is a reasonable amount that it should grow, and it's manageable, it's something that we can afford, the taxpayers can afford, then you've got to live within those bounds.
Right. So let's like kind of pivot right now, because a lot of people are talking about crime. Fairfax County is one of the large municipalities with one of the lowest crime rates. Region-wise, we're lower in crime. Talk to me a little bit about Metro and what they're doing.
Well, sure. Well, Metro, as part of this process, elected official stakeholders weighed in, and they pointed out, on the rail side, fare evasion. And it's something that's visible, so you see it. There's some amount of fare evasion on every system in the world. But when you go there and you see it happening, you notice it, and then we're talking about helping to solve financial issues. It's easy and reasonable to point that out. So a combination of increased officers in stations, we see crime significantly down, and new fare gates. Fare evasion is down something like 88%, which is phenomenal. Puts a lot more faith and trust in the system. And then crime kind of writ large throughout the region. The Council of Governments joined with the Washington Board of Trade, the Greater Washington Partnership, and the Consortium of Colleges and Universities last year to bring our police chiefs together, our elected leaders, but also our business leaders, and talk about crime and public safety. And if you look at the district, all 7 major areas of crime are down 40% year over year. Carjackings are down 50% in the district. And I often say this, we need to hold everyone accountable on issues like public safety and be loud when there's an issue. We need to be equally loud when things have gotten turned around or doing better, and applaud folks for turning things around. We can still do better.
We can always do better.
And one of the issues that we hear, we issue a crime report every year at the council. We collect it from our jurisdictions. And when we issue that, the crime data, once it's been blessed through the FBI, it takes about a year for them to say, okay, a murder was a murder, right? And we release this report, it's dated. It doesn't really help the public, it doesn't help decision makers. So what we've been doing, and we'll debut early 2025, is we're working with all 24 jurisdictions, and Fairfax is one of them, to provide monthly reporting. And we qualify, so this hasn't been blessed yet by the FBI, but it will be a real-time crime dashboard, and we'll be the first kind of council of governments in the country to have one of these. We'll house it at COG. Folks can look at in real time, and then you can make decisions if you see a spike, or you see a spike across the river and you think something might be coming to Fairfax, that you can better adjust in real time.
Yeah, you and I have had a couple conversations about that, so I really appreciate you spearheading that, because I believe it impacts our economic development, and that is an area of focus for me, obviously in Northern Virginia. but what are some of the opportunities you see for stronger cooperation and diversification of our regional economy?
Yeah.
'Cause that's what we have to get to.
Yeah, so when I was in Richmond as the governor's chief of staff, Virginia was named the best state for business by CNBC 3 out of 4 years. Only state to ever receive 3 times in a row that distinction. We helped recruit the largest economic development deal in the country's history, HQ2. Victor Hoskins, who's now running economic development here in Fairfax, was a big part of that. This is a region that when you sell to companies, they're looking at Fairfax, but they're looking at the region. They're not just looking at Tacoma, Parker, Alexandria, Montgomery, they're looking at the region. And we compete against Raleigh-Durham, Dallas, Houston, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York. They compete as regions. They think as regions. And what challenges us here in the DMV is our economic development partnerships roll up to respective secretaries of commerce that sell states, which is important. But if you take the 24 jurisdictions that encompass COG, and you said if we were our own state, what would we look like? We'd be the most educated state in the country. We'd be the most diverse state in the country. We'd be top 10 in the country for GDP. We have a lot to sell here as a region. And one of the things, if you look at a map of the country, and Department of Commerce has economic development districts, so regions that work together to sell their regions. 85% of the country sits in an EDD, economic development district. We're one of the few areas in the country that does not. So over the next year, we're pulling together all the stakeholders, the economic development directors, the chambers of commerce, all the stakeholder groups, to put together a comprehensive economic development strategy for this region and then apply to be an economic development district. But you should be able, when you travel for the holidays, you turn on in your hotel room TV, you should see an ad selling the DMV. You see it, they sell Atlanta, Georgia, they sell Houston. You don't see an ad like that for the district. We have 24 different jurisdictions selling themselves. And my job is to convince folks that if we act as a region and sell this region, you're going to be able to compete over companies that want to locate here. But you first got to get them on the hook and interested in this region. And we can do more. When you look at workforce, Bryan, a lot of people talk about workforce development. We do a great job in Virginia of doing that, but we're lining skills and jobs up of a child in Fairfax County and a child in Big Stone got 9 hours away. We're not lining those skills and jobs up with a child in Fairfax County in DC. And if you're Clark Construction and want to hire 500 employees, you want to know that there's a workforce in the DMV. And you don't care if that worker's from Prince George's County or Prince William County or the district. And those data systems don't talk to one another. Those community colleges aren't coordinating like they could be. And so getting some of those folks to sit at the table and say, what data systems do we need to share? How can we stand up an organization that really thinks about our workforce as a region?
So, you mentioned earlier that your children were dealing with COVID. Mine were at the back end of COVID. I believe children in the 5th grade or the last year of the complete online virtual, so they still have a long way to go. But when you're thinking about our local economy and our workforce, what impacts do you see forthcoming from the new administration coming forward? Because there are governmental agencies who state you need to be in the office 2 days, 1 day of pay period. A pay period, unfortunately for them, ends on a Saturday and starts on a Sunday. So you do have people doing that and then going back to wherever they were, but they used to live here. What do you see as the impact with the next administration?
Well, folks like to have a crystal ball and try to guess. We'll see what happens. The executive branch works with the legislative branch. We'll see what kind of return to office mandate there might be. I'll say a couple things. Fairfax County has 76,000 federal workers, not to mention all the contractors. That is 10 times the size, just on the federal government worker size, 10 times the size of the workforce for HQ2. So a tremendous asset here. And this is both of my grandparents moved here, one from Kentucky to work at Department of Agriculture, one from the Northern Neck to join the Air Force and was stationed at Fort Myer and the Pentagon. This has been a place where people have moved for generations to make a difference, whether you're in the private sector, the public sector, nonprofit. And I would suggest it's the most exciting time to be in this region. When you think about the things people talk about, whether it's artificial intelligence, healthcare, energy, defense, all of those industries, even if you're working in the private sector, have a major overlap with public policy and the regulatory regime. If you're working in AI, you shouldn't be in Silicon Valley. You should be here.
Right here.
If you want to work in cyber, you should be here. So it's an exciting time to sell, and it's been a very proud career to have as part of the federal government. I will say, Bryan, oftentimes in government, you see the pendulum swing from, I'll say, one extreme to the other without really hitting in the middle. And a lot of times you probably need to moderate and hit a little bit more in the middle. And we went pre-COVID, in the office 5 days a week, a level of rigidity where, hey, I've got to pick my child up. Well, you take vacation this afternoon. Let someone work from home.
Yeah, but
Clark,
but here, how do we dumb this down, man?
Well, we're dumbing it down. So now we may go to the opposite extreme,
Right.
which during COVID we're working remotely. I think what I do at my organization, what I would suggest for the federal government coming in is you need to find something that's more moderate and in between.
Okay.
In-person work for me in terms of productivity is really, really important. That's my number one reason why I think it's important. It doesn't have to do with economics or buying coffee downtown. It's productivity and moving big ideas forward. That being said, you need to show grace to your employees and have some flexibility. And if the new administration's putting a policy in, and the point of that policy is to show grace and build up and value the federal workforce, let's see how we can work together. If it's being put in place because a roundabout way to downsize the side of the federal government and have folks retire early, if it's put in place with malicious intent, you want to be wary of a policy like that. But I do think the policy has gotten a little bit too far to one extreme in terms of you're in every day, no exceptions. You're hardly in ever at all, and somewhere in between is where we've got to hit, because to provide the services you do to taxpayers, and these are taxpayer jobs. Taxpayers are paying these jobs. Being in person is important.
Very much so. Very much so. So I appreciate it. And when you went to the pendulum, I had to use that little comment about dumbing it down, because again, I needed to be somewhere in the middle to get us going forward. But now, climate and energy program is one of the nation's, COGS is one of the nation's first initiatives to address climate change on a regional level. The centerpiece of this work, the Metropolitan Washington 2030 Climate Action and Energy Action Plan. Fairfax County also has their Climate Energy Action Plan, but share it with me where you're heading with yours, because I think we do dovetail off of each other. And we have worked well with each other. My guy, John Morrow, has been working well with your group. But tell us where you think we're going.
And this is one of those issues that it doesn't just, clean air just doesn't stop at the border of Fairfax County. It's something that requires multiple governments working together. And so at the council, our elected officials across this region said they wanted to lower greenhouse gases, set some ambitious goals. We met the first goal, lowering greenhouse gases by 20% by 2020. And now we're striving for a 50% reduction by 2050. And that's ambitious, and it's going to be difficult. But we're doing good work in this region. We've talked about transit, and obviously the emissions from cars on the road. More folks taking public transit helps with that. Yeah. We have a electric vehicle plan that we're working on. Fairfax County is applying for money from the feds, trying to figure out where their stations go. So is Alexander, so is Montgomery County, so is DC. So we've pulled the whole region together, and let's try to get a handle on how many stations we need. How are we going to power them? Where are they going to be? Are they going to be safe for people to use? And then you can use in Fairfax County that plan to then go apply for federal funds. When you get the air quality alerts in the summer, when there are the wildfires that came down from Canada, we take those air measurements and we put that out for the regions. We have a group, Bryan, that does water restoration work. So the Anacostia River is one of our biggest projects, but if you have a body of water here in Fairfax County, your supervisors were curious, hey, is it healthy? What do we need to do to restore it? We go out, we take the measurements, here's a plan of how you could bring it back to better health. So it's not just one thing, it's a variety and that's really what our members look towards. They set ambitious goals, but then they got to look to staff someone to help them meet those goals.
So that kind of dovetails into my next question for you, is a collaboration between our local leaders on the local side as well as the state level. It's never easy because we have differing thoughts and priorities, strategies that we use. I mean, when you are now at COG, what are you trying to do? As you have mentioned several times, you have the district, you have the state of Maryland, you have Northern Virginia. What kind of strategies are you using to help move you forward?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, if I was on a podcast in Montgomery or Prince George's County, I'd say the same thing I'm saying in Fairfax County. So it's being straight up and honest with everyone in the region, working hard, being a good friend, not worrying about who gets the credit when we do good things, and also knowing your audience. I mean, let's go back to WMATA and transit. The Northern Virginia footprint for the council is little old Northern Virginia, which geographically is like less than 5% of the state of Virginia, is 42% of the GDP. So you're interested in Metro, if you're in Richmond, you may be interested in the clean energy aspects to it. You may be interested in the equity and freedom aspects of it. People need to be able to get throughout the region. But every major construction project that you see in the DMV that has a crane is probably co-located at a Metro site. And our biggest employers will tell you in Richmond just how important it is for their businesses to be located at a station. We generate from WMATA $1 billion of tax revenues go down to Richmond every year that can be directly tied to Metro. So that's a message that resonates with folks that are trying to grow the economy and generate tax revenue across the Commonwealth. So depending on who you're talking to, understand what their priorities and understand what their concerns are. With Metro, we've got to figure out some answers to some tough questions. Don't just skim over those questions. Don't ignore them. Get folks answers and figure out solutions for folks.
Well, Clark, working with you has been an absolute joy over the last couple of years. We've gone through a lot together. We haven't always agreed, but the one thing I will say is that no matter when we disagree, we'll always come back the same day saying, hey, let's go have dinner or something. We talk frequently. I just want to make sure all the people listening to this podcast, it's probably not a day, maybe on weekends, that you and I do not have a communication. It could be a funny text, it could be a non-funny text, or it could be a phone call. I do want to say thank you for coming out here to do this with us. And when you do get a podcast in the D.C. or Maryland, 1-800-CALL Bryan so we can do another one, all right?
No, you'll be my phone a friend, and you're a public servant at heart, as am I, and we love Fairfax County. We love this region. So we get up every day trying to figure out how can we make it a better place to live.
That's all we're here to do. Yep. We're public servants. We try to make everything better. And I want to thank you for taking the leadership with DMV Moves. As you know, Jack McDougall from Board of Trades and myself are trying to get people all on the same page and then providing our elected officials with a path forward, but that wouldn't have been possible without you. So I want to say thank you. And that's going to do it for this episode of Connect with County Leaders podcast. My thanks to my friend Clark Mercer, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, for being here. And thanks to you for joining us. I look forward to talking with you again next month on another Connect with County Leaders podcast.